Arthur Green hadn't always walked so slowly. Time, age, and 3 wars had carved deep lines into his skin and slowed the rhythm of his steps, but inside, beneath the layers of fading strength and aching joints, the man who had once faced artillery fire with unflinching calm still lived and breathed. That afternoon, like many before it, he ventured out into the neighborhood for his weekly ritual, a quiet walk and a single eclair from the small bakery on 3rd Street. He wore his usual coat, faded and carefully mended, and leaned gently on a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. The spring sun filtered through the trees above, and for a moment, the world felt still, almost kind. Then the laughter came, sharp, cruel, and too loud for the quiet block. A cluster of teenagers sprawled across the narrow sidewalk, claiming space they hadn't earned with the arrogance of those who believed consequences were for other people. Arthur recognized them, not by name but by pattern. The slouched shoulders, the sneering mouths, the casual menace in their eyes. He'd seen those looks before, though not on the battlefield, in alleyways in cities under siege, in the way fear sometimes curdled into disrespect. He approached without hesitation, not defiant, but with the gentle dignity of someone who had nothing to prove. "Excuse me, lads," he said, his voice roughened by age, but still steady. "May I pass?" One of them looked up, a smirk spreading slowly across his face. He was tall and lean, his baseball cap turned backward like a careless crown. "Old soldier, huh?" he said mockingly, as if the term itself were a joke. "What are you, like 100? Arthur didn't rise to the bait. "Just heading to the bakery. Would you mind giving me a bit of space?" "Yeah, I think we do mind," the boy shot back. He stretched out his legs further, completely blocking the path. Another voice chimed in from the bench, laughter, louder now, emboldened by the crowd. "Why don't you just go home, Grandpa, before you fall over and break a hip?" The words stung more than Arthur cared to admit, not because they carried any real power, but because they came from boys who'd never known hardship, who wielded cruelty like a toy. He could have turned away, walked the long way around, but something in him resisted. He had walked through the bombed-out ruins of cities. He had seen friends fall beside him in the mud. He had carried the weight of memory and loss for decades. He would not step aside for mockery. "There's no need for rudeness," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'm only asking for courtesy." "Courtesy," the boy laughed, standing up now looming. "Maybe you should show some respect to your betters." Then it happened, swift, thoughtless, and deliberate. As Arthur stepped forward, the teen moved sideways, thrusting a leg out in a trip, while his hand shoved Arthur's shoulder with just enough force to shift his balance. The cane slipped from his fingers. Gravity took hold. "Watch it, old man." The world tilted, the curb vanishing beneath his feet. Horns screamed in the distance as a car swerved violently to avoid the frail body stumbling into its path. For one terrible moment, Arthur felt the empty weightlessness of falling, of being cast out of his place in the world. But instinct, deep, hardwired training, snapped into action. He twisted, caught his footing, and staggered upright, barely avoiding collapse. On the sidewalk behind him, the boys howled with laughter. One of them mimicked a stumbling dance, mocking the old man's near-death like it was slapstick comedy. "Look at him move. Maybe he learned that in the war." Arthur's face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with a hot, bitter anger that he hadn't tasted in years. Not for the pain, though his hip throbbed and his hands trembled as he picked up his fallen cane, but for the complete and utter disregard. He had faced enemies who had tried to kill him with more honor than these children showed in their amusement. A woman approached, her voice soft, worried. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her hands hovering near his arm, unsure of how to help. "I'll be fine," Arthur replied, his voice tight. "Thank you." He forced a smile, but inside, the old soldier stirred. He didn't want vengeance, but neither would he let this pass into silence. He looked down the alley where they had disappeared, still laughing, still blind to what they had done. Then he turned away from the bakery. The eclair could wait. There were other calls to make. That night, the memory refused to release him. It clung to his thoughts like damp fog over a trench, insidious, persistent. Sleep came in fragments, broken by flashes of memory. The boy's shove, the laughter, the look of pride on the face of someone who had done harm and found it funny. Arthur lay awake in the quiet of his modest flat, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for it to give him answers. Outside, the city's night noises crept in through the window, distant sirens and rustling leaves blending into the silent churn of his mind. He wasn't afraid. That part of himself had long been buried under years of standing his ground in places far darker than a suburban sidewalk. But what stirred inside him now wasn't fear. It was something far more unsettling, an ache of purpose, sharp and cold. Not rage, not revenge, but the urgent clarity that sometimes comes to men who have already lost too much to tolerate casual cruelty. In the morning, he shaved carefully, dressed with quiet deliberation, and pinned a small bronze badge, his old regimental insignia, to the lapel of his jacket. He hadn't worn it in years, not out of shame, but because the past had always belonged in a private place. Today, he let it show. There was something symbolic about it, something steadying. The community center was quiet when he arrived. A few volunteers were setting up chairs for a parenting seminar. A whiteboard leaned against the wall listing upcoming events: chess club, first aid training, community safety talks. Arthur stepped past them, nodded politely, and walked with purpose to the director's office. Marie Thomas looked up from her computer, surprised. "Mr. Green, this is a rare visit." "I need to speak," he said. "Not privately. Publicly." She blinked. "About what?" He sat down across from her, hands clasped tightly around his cane. "Yesterday, I was assaulted. Not in some far-off war. Right here. 3 boys, local, young, found amusement in tripping an old man into traffic. They laughed when I nearly died. And I suspect it isn't the first time they've treated someone like that." Marie's smile faded into quiet tension. "I'm so sorry. Did you call the police?" "No," he said. "Not yet. But I intend to do more than just file a report. I want to speak at the next town meeting. I want to talk about the disease of indifference." Her eyes softened. "Arthur, are you sure? That's a lot to bring into public view." He met her gaze without blinking. "That's why I must. Silence is what allows this to spread. Indifference is contagious. If we don't name it, face it, we surrender to it." She nodded slowly. "We can schedule you in. You'll have 5 minutes." "Give me 4, he replied. "I'll make it enough." That night, he wrote. Not a speech, not really. Just thoughts poured raw onto paper. He didn't try to sound noble. He didn't mask the anger or the sorrow. He wrote about watching friends bleed in foreign fields for a peace that meant something. He wrote about coming home to a country that no longer seemed to see its elders, its veterans, its quiet survivors. And he wrote about the sidewalk, the shove, the laugh. The inhuman ease with which some children now found pleasure in the humiliation of others. The meeting hall was full. Arthur stood at the front, the microphone adjusted awkwardly low. The air was too warm, the lights too bright. But when he spoke, the room leaned into his silence. "I am not here to demand punishment," he began. "I am here to ask a question. What are we teaching our sons? What do we let pass as just kids being kids? Because yesterday I was nearly killed by a boy who looked me in the eye and shoved me into traffic for fun." A murmur moved through the crowd. I don't blame him alone. I blame all of us for letting it fester, for turning our eyes away when respect decayed into mockery, when empathy gave way to spectacle. Somewhere along the line, we stopped reminding our young that kindness is strength, that cruelty is cowardice. He paused. The silence was thick now. I wore a uniform for 40 years. Not for medals. For belief. Belief in a country where people looked out for each other, where honor meant something. And now I ask you, do we still live in that country? His voice wavered, not with weakness, but with the weight of truth. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for action. Talk to your children. Walk your streets. Stand up when someone else is pushed down. Not for me. For them. Because a boy who laughs while another man falls is already wounded in a way that uniforms and flags can't fix. He stepped back. The hall remained hushed, stunned by the echo of his words. And in that silence, something shifted, not thunderously, not publicly, but subtly, like the first breeze before a storm clears the sky. Arthur left without waiting for applause. He had not come to be heard. He had come to remind. And though the walk back to his flat was slow, it no longer felt quite so heavy. The badge on his chest caught the streetlight's glow, as if saluting the night. Somewhere behind him, the quiet whisper of change had begun. 3 days passed. Arthur did not expect ripples from his speech. The world, he had long understood, was not a place easily shaken by quiet truths. But something had been set in motion. Subtle, invisible at first, like the deep shift of fault lines beneath calm earth. A phone call came late in the evening. An unfamiliar voice, polite, firm, too disciplined to waste words. "Mr. Arthur Green? This is Captain Miles Bennett, 3rd Battalion, Royal Marines." Arthur sat up straighter, the name hanging like frost in the air. "We saw your statement. It made its way through channels. A few of us, well, we've been talking." Arthur remained silent. He could hear the edge in the man's tone, not pity, not curiosity, but a kind of restless respect, like the sound of boots shifting just before a salute. "We'd like to meet. No press. No ceremony. Just a few of us." Arthur's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the phone. He stared at it for a long moment, then quietly whispered, "Bloody hell. They came on a Sunday. 5 of them. No banners, no spectacle. Just a small convoy of dark green vehicles pulling up along the curb outside Arthur Street. The neighbors peeked through blinds, uncertain. A child pointed. A mother hushed him. But there was no hostility in the air, only a strange, collective stillness, as if the street itself was holding its breath. The Marines stepped out one by one, dressed in civilian clothing but moving with unmistakable bearing. Back straight, gaze forward, tension coiled beneath quiet composure. Not a parade. A presence. And at the center of them walked a man with sharp eyes and a silver ring around his wrist tattoo. Captain Bennett. Arthur opened the door before they knocked. "You're early," he said, tone dry, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a glint, not of sentiment, but of old steel being sharpened by memory. "Marines rarely arrive late, sir," Bennett replied. "Don't call me sir. I've not worn rank in years." "You haven't stopped carrying it," Bennett said gently. And there, in that simple statement, was a bond that needed no explanation. They didn't stay inside. Arthur led them instead to the small park nearby, the one where the incident had happened. It felt right, somehow, to return to the place where the silence had first been broken. The Marines followed without question, forming a quiet perimeter, without being told. Old instincts. Unspoken protocol. "This where it happened?" one of them asked. Arthur nodded. Bennett stood beside him, watching the playground in the distance. "We heard about the boys. Local lads. Already known to social services. Rough home situations." Arthur didn't flinch. "That's not an excuse. But it is part of the picture." Bennett nodded. "Agreed. That's why we're here." And then something shifted in tone. What followed was not just a meeting of soldiers, past and present. It became a conversation about responsibility, about the vacuum left when fathers disappear, when schools surrender, when communities fall silent in the face of rising cruelty masked as youth rebellion. Bennett had an idea, something he and a few others had been mulling over for months. Youth mentorship, rooted in discipline and dignity. No lectures, just presence. Teaching through example, not sermons. The core way. Arthur turned toward him slowly. "You want to bring Marines into this neighborhood? We want to bring what the Corps gave us, structure, pride, self-respect, into places that need it most. You gave the signal, Arthur. We just answered it." For a long moment, Arthur said nothing. The wind stirred fallen leaves at his feet. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Life went on. But here, something was changing, not in fanfare but in form. "I'm not your symbol," Arthur finally said. Bennett smiled. "You're our catalyst. There's a difference." And so it began. Not with speeches or newspaper headlines, but with presence. Every week, a small team of Marines on leave, off duty, or recently retired began walking the streets. Not patrolling, just being there. Talking. Listening. Setting quiet examples. They ran fitness sessions at the community center. Taught boys how to shake hands properly. Showed them how to stand, how to speak with clarity, how to own the weight of their choices. At first, the kids mocked them, called them names, tested boundaries. But Marines do not flinch easily. And discipline, when wrapped in patience and sincerity, has a way of drawing even the most lost back toward a center they didn't know they'd missed. Arthur watched it unfold from a distance. He never inserted himself. But every once in a while, a boy would stop him on the street. "You're the old guy from the meeting, right?" And he would nod. "Those Marines said you fought somewhere. Was it real?" And Arthur would look them in the eye, not as a victim, not as a relic, but as a man who knew what real meant. "Yes," he'd reply. "It was. And so is this." What began with a fall on the pavement became a movement grounded in resilience. Not a revolution. A reclamation. Of responsibility. Of respect. Of manhood, reshaped not by aggression, but by dignity in the face of pain. Arthur walked slower now, but every step echoed louder than it ever had in the years of marching. For he walked no longer alone. Not in silence. Not in fear. But with the knowledge that he had lit a fuse, not of violence, but of vigilance. And in that quiet war for decency, the Marines had arrived, not to fight, but to rebuild. At first, the boys avoided the park. There was something about the way the air had changed, about the presence of the Marines and the quiet way the neighborhood had begun to watch itself again, that made the once liberated space feel unfamiliar, almost sacred. The laughter they used to weaponize had thinned into uncertainty. The swagger that once marked their territory now faltered under the weight of unspoken shame. Especially for one of them, Jamie. He had been the loudest that day. Not the oldest, but the quickest to taunt, to mock, to circle Arthur's crumpled form on the ground like a hyena seeking validation from his pack. But when Arthur stood and spoke, not with rage, but with a kind of wounded command, something inside Jamie splintered. Not enough to stop him then, but enough to seed something. A discomfort. A dissonance. Guilt, like infection, does not always declare itself in fever. It can linger as a low, chronic ache, silent, persistent, reshaping a boy's spine over weeks until he can no longer stand upright under the weight of his own reflection. Jamie hadn't told anyone. Not his mother, whose eyes were already too tired to look past her own regrets. Not his mates, who had begun drifting away ever since the Marines arrived. They mocked less now. They argued more. The glue that had once bound them, shared anger, bored defiance, was drying, cracking. One Thursday afternoon, Jamie stood outside the community center. Hands in his pockets, hoodie pulled tight. He wasn't sure why he'd come. He wasn't sure what he expected. He only knew he didn't want to carry it anymore. Inside, a few Marines were finishing up a mentoring session. Laughter spilled out. Real laughter, the kind that doesn't demand submission. Jamie flinched. He wasn't ready for warmth. He almost turned back. But then he saw Arthur. Alone, near the far wall. Watching. Listening. Present as he often was. Not participating, but bearing witness. Jamie's breath caught. He remembered the sound of Arthur hitting the pavement. The sharpness of bone on concrete. He remembered laughing. He remembered something in Arthur's face that hadn't been fear, but disappointment, and somehow, that had been worse. He walked inside. The moment Arthur looked up, Jamie stopped moving. The room stilled, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with a quiet, natural awareness, like a forest pausing to sense a shift in wind. Arthur's eyes met his. No anger, no contempt, just a gaze that refused to look away. Jamie walked forward. Every step a small defiance of the voice in his head that told him to run, to joke, to punch his way out of shame. He stopped 2 feet in front of Arthur, opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I'm sorry," he said. The words fell like stone into water, no echo, just impact. Arthur didn't smile, didn't rush to forgive. He simply nodded, slowly, deliberately. "I know," he said, and it was enough. That moment did not erase what had been done. Jamie still had to answer to the law. Charges had been filed. A juvenile hearing was set. There would be consequences, not to crush him, but to mark the truth that actions, however rooted in pain, are not without cost. The day of the hearing, Arthur attended, not to prosecute, but to witness. The courtroom was small. Jamie's voice trembled as he read his statement, but he didn't look away. He spoke of choices, of regret, of a man he had once seen as weak and now saw as something else entirely. "Mr. Green didn't just stand up that day. He made me see what standing up looks like. I can't undo it, but I can grow from it, if I'm allowed." The judge listened. The prosecutor, too. And when Arthur was asked if he had anything to say, he stood slowly, his joints aching, but his voice clear. "He made a mistake," Arthur said. "But he showed up. That matters more than people think." The court chose to place Jamie in a restorative program, one guided by the very Marines he had once mocked, under the quiet endorsement of the man he had harmed. It would be long, it would be hard, but it would be his path. And he would walk it, step by step. In time, the story reached further than anyone expected. Not through newspapers or viral clips, but through quiet networks of teachers, mentors, fathers who had been absent and now wanted to return. Schools began inviting the Marines to speak. Other neighborhoods began asking, "How did you change the tide?" Arthur, when asked, would say only, "We didn't change it. We just stopped pretending it wasn't drowning us." Remorse did not rewrite the past, but it redrew the future. And in a world too often taught to choose between vengeance or silence, Arthur and Jamie had carved out something different: accountability with hope. The cost of that fall would always remain etched in Arthur's bones. But so too would the truth that even the deepest bruises can become marks of turning, not just of pain. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the earth itself needed time to thaw from everything it had absorbed. Rain fell in long, thoughtful sheets, rinsing the city's concrete bones. Children returned to the park, not in defiance, but with something gentler in their steps. The graffiti had faded, some of it scrubbed away, some of it weathered into ghost text. And the bench where Arthur had once fallen now stood freshly painted, bearing a brass plaque. It read, "To those who stand, even when no one else does." Arthur hadn't asked for it. In truth, he was uncomfortable with recognition. The ceremony had been proposed by the local council, nudged forward by the community center, the Marines, and even Jamie's mother, who had taken to attending every youth mentoring session since her son's hearing. A way, they said, to close a circle, to honor not just Arthur, but the change that had rippled outward from that singular, brutal afternoon. At first, Arthur declined. He didn't want applause. He didn't need speeches. What had happened to him wasn't a victory. It was a rupture. And healing wasn't a parade. It was work, silent and repetitive and deeply lonely. But then he thought of the boy who had once spit on his shoes, who now shook his hand every Tuesday before class. He thought of the kids who came to the community center not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He thought of the quiet look of pride in the eyes of a once jaded Marine now mentoring teens like they were worthy of his time. And he understood. Sometimes, people don't show up to celebrate you. They show up because you gave them permission to believe in better. So he said yes. The day of the ceremony was overcast, but the sky held its reign. Folding chairs had been set in careful rows. Children clutched handmade signs. The mayor spoke, the local pastor read a verse, and the Marine captain who had once knelt beside Arthur in the park gave a quiet, unsentimental speech about courage. And then Jamie stepped up. The wind toyed with his paper. His voice trembled, but his spine held straight. "When we hurt someone, we expect them to disappear," he said. Arthur didn't. He stayed. He looked at us, even when we wouldn't look at him. And somehow, he still believed we could be better. I don't know if I could have done that. But I know I want to now. There were tears. Some silent, some brave enough to fall. Arthur stood only when they called his name. He didn't wave. Didn't bow. He simply walked forward, calm and solid, like a man returning to the ground that had once broken him. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was steadfast, like rain on a roof. A kind of music that didn't demand celebration, only presence. He accepted the plaque with a nod, looked at the crowd, then said, "I'm not a hero. I was just tired of running. And when you stop running, you find others who are waiting to stop too." He stepped down. That was all. But for many, it was everything. In the weeks that followed, the park filled again. Not with noise, but with life. Kids kicked footballs, grandmothers walked their dogs, teenagers leaned into laughter without cruelty. And on certain days, Arthur could be found on that same bench, not as a symbol, but as a man. Sometimes with Jamie, sometimes with others. Always watching, always present. His scars didn't fade. Some nights were still hard, some memories still sharp. But the difference now was this: he no longer carried them alone. Respect hadn't come in headlines or medals. It came in eye contact, in changed behavior, in shared silence. It came in knowing that when he had chosen to stand, not with fists, but with dignity, the world, slowly, had risen to meet him. And though he would never say it, in the quiet of that park, under a sky he had once feared would never clear, Arthur had finally allowed himself a truth he'd never dared claim before. He mattered, and that was enough.